The great chamber of the conclave stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian and floating light. And within its vast circular space gathered the rulers of 12 civilizations that had shaped the galaxy for 10,000 years. Ambassador Lyra Chun stood at the center of this impossibly large room. A single human woman surrounded by beings that could crush her world with a single command. And she felt the weight of their attention pressing down upon her like a physical force. The Valadorians towered above her in their designated section, their stone-like bodies standing nearly 4 meters tall, and their eyes glowed with the deep orange light of ancient furnaces burning within their mineral flesh. Beside them, the Cathra delegation clicked and buzzed in their insectoid language, their compound eyes reflecting the chamber lights in thousands of fractured images. And their razor-sharp mandibles never stopped moving as they whispered to one another. High Arbiter Thesson of the Conclave rose from his throne of living crystal, his reptilian scales shimmering with colors that had no name in human languages. And when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a being who had ruled for 3 centuries. "The matter before us is simple," Thesson announced, his words translating through the chamber's systems into 100 different languages. "The Varax Dominion has declared war upon the civilized galaxy, and their fleet of 30,000 warships now moves toward the Orion Spur." A holographic display materialized in the center of the chamber, showing the spiral arm of the galaxy, where human colonies had spread across 47 worlds over the past 200 years. Earth and its colonies stand directly in the path of the Varax advance. Thesson continued, his cold eyes fixing upon Ambassador Chun. "The Conclave has assembled a unified defense fleet, and we require contributions from all member species and all affiliated worlds." Fleet Admiral Vertan of the Valadorians stepped forward, his massive stone feet shaking the floor with each movement, and his voice rumbled like an avalanche when he spoke. "We have calculated the minimum acceptable contribution from the human territories," Vertan declared. "You will provide 300 warships to join the unified fleet, or you will be branded as cowards and abandoned to face the Varax alone." Lyra Chun did not flinch at the threat, and she did not look away from the massive alien who could have crushed her with one hand. She had prepared for this moment her entire career, and she had practiced her response until the words felt like part of her soul. "The Conclave's terms are understood," she said, her voice calm and clear despite the translator that carried it throughout the chamber. "Earth has considered its response carefully." The chamber fell silent as every alien species present turned their attention to the small human woman, curious to hear how her primitive world would respond to the demands of galactic civilization. "Humanity will contribute to the defense of the Orion Spur," Lyra announced. "We will send 1 ship." For a long moment nobody spoke, and the silence stretched across the vast chamber like a held breath. Then the Cathra began to click, their mandibles in what humans had learned to recognize as laughter, and the sound spread through their delegation like ripples. Across still water, Admiral Vertan's stone face cracked into an expression that might have been disbelief or might have been amusement, and his orange eyes blazed brighter as he processed what the human had said. "1 ship," he repeated, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You offer 1 ship against 30,000 Varax warships?" "That is correct," Lyra replied without hesitation. High Arbiter Thesson leaned forward on his throne, his reptilian eyes narrowing to slits as he studied the human ambassador with new intensity. "Is this human arrogance or human surrender?" he demanded. "Do you mock the Conclave with this pathetic offer, or have you simply accepted that your species will be exterminated?" Lyra Chun allowed herself a small smile, the kind of expression that humans made when they knew something that others did not. "It is neither arrogance nor surrender," she answered. "It is human precision." The Valadorian admiral slammed his massive fist against the railing before him, and the impact sent cracks spreading through the polished stone, Precision? Lortan roared. What precision can one ship provide against the largest invasion fleet in galactic history? You will see, Lyra said simply. The Kethra ambassador rose from their position, their wings buzzing with agitation as they addressed the human directly. Perhaps you do not understand the Virax, the insectoid being chittered. They do not negotiate, they do not accept surrender, and they do not show mercy. We understand them perfectly, Lyra replied. And something in her voice made the Kethra ambassador pause. The Virax have conquered 11 species, the ambassador continued. They have burned entire worlds and harvested populations for slave labor. And they have never lost a single campaign. Then they are overdue for a lesson. Lyra said. High Arbiter Thesson raised one clawed hand to silence the chamber, and his ancient eyes studied the human woman with an expression that had shifted from contempt to curiosity. You speak with confidence that borders on madness, Thesson observed. What ship could possibly justify such confidence? Its name is the Remember, Lyra answered, and it carries the memory of everything humanity has survived. The Valadorians exchanged glances that humans could not read, and the Kethra buzzed among themselves in confusion. We know of no human vessel by that name, Admiral Vertan said, his voice now carrying a hint of uncertainty. Our intelligence networks have cataloged every ship in your fleet. No, Lyra corrected him gently. You have cataloged every ship we allowed you to see. The chamber erupted into chaos as a dozen species began shouting questions and accusations, and the noise rose to a deafening roar that shook the floating lights above. But Lyra Chun stood calm at the center of the storm, her hands clasped behind her back and her expression unchanging. She had delivered her message. And now the galaxy would learn what humanity truly was. The Conclave could mock her world and dismiss her people as primitive newcomers to the galactic stage. But that would change soon enough, because the Remember was coming. And with it came 200 years of human determination forged in the fires of near-extinction Lyra thought of the crew who even now prepared their vessel for the journey ahead. 300 volunteers who had trained their entire lives for a battle they hoped would never come. She thought of the technology hidden within that dark angular hull. Weapons and shields that represented the combined genius of a species that had learned to fight against impossible odds. And she thought of the 4 billion names inscribed within the ship's memorial chamber. The ghosts of those who had died so that humanity could survive its first contact with hostile alien life. The galaxy would question why humans sent one ship. And by the time they learned the answer, it would be far too late for Question's ambassador. Chum bowed slightly to the assembled conclave and turned to walk from the chamber, leaving behind a room full of beings who did not yet understand what they had just witnessed, but they would understand soon enough. The Remember was coming, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same. The news spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass, and within hours every inhabited world had heard about the human folly-on. The trade stations of the Kethra Collective, the insectoid merchants, clicked their mandibles in amusement as they shared the story with their customers. And soon the tale of humanity's single ship became the most popular joke in 3 sectors. Valadorians composed war ballads mocking the primitive Earth species, and their deep rumbling voices echoed through mountain halls as they sang of the foolish humans who thought one vessel could stand against an armada. News feeds across 100 worlds broadcast endless commentary about what they called the human folly. And experts from every species offered their opinions on why Earth had chosen such an absurd response to the Conclave's demands. Some said the humans were simply too stupid to understand the scale of the threat they faced, while others argued that Earth had already surrendered in spirit and sent the single ship as a token. Gesture betting pools formed on thousands of stations and planets, and gamblers wagered fortunes on how quickly the lone human vessel would be destroyed when it faced the Vorax fleet. The most generous odds gave the human ship 11 seconds of survival, while the most pessimistic predicted it would be vaporized before it could even power up its weapons. Meanwhile, the unified Conclave fleet gathered at the rally point near the Thesan Nebula, and 2,400 warships from 12 different species arranged themselves in precise battle formations. Admiral Vertan stood on the bridge of his flagship, a massive Valadorian dreadnought called the Mountain's Wrath that measured 8 kilometers from bow to stern, and he watched his tactical displays with growing impatience. "Where is this human vessel?" he demanded of his sensor officer. "They were supposed to arrive 3 standard hours ago. No sign of them on long-range sensors," the officer reported. "Perhaps they have reconsidered their foolish decision?" Vertan's stone face twisted into what might have been a smile, and he turned to address the other commanders who watched him through holographic links. "It seems the humans have abandoned their bravado," he announced. "Perhaps they finally realized that one ship cannot." His words cut off as alarms began to sound throughout his bridge, and every sensor display suddenly lit up with a new contact, ship emerging from hyperspace. The sensor officer called out, "Single vessel, bearing directly toward the fleet." On screen, Vertan commanded. The main view screen flickered and displayed the approaching vessel, and for a long moment, nobody on the bridge spoke. The human ship was unremarkable at first glance. A dark angular craft, perhaps 2 kilometers long, with a hull that seemed to absorb light rather than reflected it. Had no visible weapon arrays, no obvious shield generators, and no markings except for a single designation painted in white letters along its side, UES, remember. That is their champion? One of the Kethra commanders chittered through the communication link. That pathetic thing is supposed to help defend the galaxy? Laughter rippled through the fleet's command network as officers from a dozen species mocked the human vessel. And even Vertan felt his contempt rising as he studied the tiny ship. It was smaller than most of his escort frigates, and it looked like something a student might have designed as a practice exercise. Human vessel. Vertan opened a direct channel to the approaching ship. "You may position yourself at the rear of the formation, and we would not want you underfoot when the real fighting begins." The response came from a human woman whose voice carried no fear and no hesitation despite the mockery she must have heard. "Acknowledged, Admiral," she said. "But we will not be staying with the fleet." Vertan's orange eyes narrowed as he processed her words, and before he could demand an explanation, the human ship's engines flared with sudden brilliant light that, remember, did not move toward the rear of the formation as instructed. And it did not take up a defensive position among the larger Allied vessels. Instead, it accelerated forward, pushing past the front lines of the Conclave fleet and heading directly toward the empty space where the Vorax Armada would soon emerge. "What are they doing?" the Kethra commander demanded. "Have they gone insane?" "Human vessel, return to formation immediately," Vertan commanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had crushed rebellions and conquered worlds. "You will obey Conclave Fleet Command or face consequences." "Negative, Admiral," the human woman replied calmly. "We have our own mission parameters, and we did not come here to hide behind your fleet." The Remember continued to accelerate, its engines burning with a light that seemed somehow wrong to Vertan's experienced eyes. And within minutes, it had left the Conclave formation far behind. "Let them go." High Arbiter Thyssen spoke through the command network, his reptilian voice carrying cold amusement. "When the Vorax arrive, they will destroy that foolish vessel in seconds. And perhaps the humans will learn humility from the experience. And if they do not?" Vertan asked. "Then Earth will have one less ship and one less crew of fools," Thyssen replied. "Either way, it is not our concern." The fleet commanders turned their attention back to their battle preparations. and the lone human ship became nothing more than a distant blip on their sensors. But aboard, the Remember Captain Sarah Chun stood on her bridge and looked out at the stars ahead. The same stars where death was coming for everything she had sworn to protect. She was Ambassador Lyra Chun's younger sister, and she had trained for this moment since she was old enough to understand what the Harvesters had taken from humanity. 300 crew members stood at their stations throughout the ship, each one a volunteer who had passed tests that would have broken lesser beings, and each one carried the names of lost loved ones in their hearts. "All stations report ready," her first officer announced. "Weapon systems are charged and shield generators are operating at full capacity." Sarah nodded and turned to face her crew through the ship's internal communication system. "This is the captain," she said. "In approximately 4 hours, the Varax fleet will emerge from hyperspace. And when they do, they will find us waiting." She paused and let her words sink in. "The galaxy thinks we are fools, and the Conclave believes we have come here to die. But they do not know what we carry." She pressed her hand against the bulkhead beside her, feeling the thrum of power that ran through the ship's systems like blood through veins. "They do not know what humanity learned in the 9 years of the Harvester War, and they do not know what we built in the 2 centuries since." Her voice hardened with determination that had been forged in the memory of 4 billion dead. "Today, we show them. And today, we make our ancestors proud." The crew responded with a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a prayer, but something in between. And the Remember continued its journey toward the place where history would be written in fire and light. Behind them, the Conclave fleet waited in comfortable arrogance, certain that they understood how this battle would unfold. They were wrong. The void of space tore open like a wound across reality, and from that wound poured the Varax Dominion's invasion fleet in numbers that defied comprehension. 32,000 warships emerged from hyperspace in a formation that stretched across thousands of kilometers, their hulls gleaming with the dark red metal that the Varax harvested from conquered worlds. Each vessel bristled with weapons designed for one purpose alone, and that purpose was the complete and total annihilation of anything that stood in the Dominion's path. Overlord Krethvax stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, a massive vessel that served as both his throne and his weapon of terror. His scaled skin was the color of dried blood, and his 4 arms were thick with muscle built from a lifetime of warfare, and his eyes burned with the cold hunger of a predator who had never known defeat. "Report," he commanded, his voice like grinding metal. "Emergence successful, Overlord," his tactical officer replied. "All fleet elements have arrived at the designated coordinates, and we detect the enemy fleet approximately 600,000 kilometers ahead." Krethvax bared his fangs in what passed for a smile among his people, and he studied the sensor display that showed the pathetic force that had gathered to oppose him. 2,400 ships, he observed with contempt. "The Conclave sends children to face the storm. They will break within the first hour, Overlord," his officer agreed. "Our projections show total victory within." The officer stopped speaking as a new contact appeared on his display, and his scales paled with confusion. "Overlord, there is an anomaly," he reported. "A single vessel has positioned itself directly in our fleet's path, separated from the main enemy formation." Krethvax turned his attention to the indicated contact and magnified the image until he could see the lone ship that floated in the darkness between the 2 forces. It was small and angular and completely alone, and it made no move to retreat or evade as his massive fleet approached. "What is this?" Krethvax demanded. "A sacrifice offering, a distraction, or perhaps a communication vessel seeking to negotiate." "Unknown, Overlord," the tactical officer replied with uncertainty in his voice. "The vessel is simply holding position, and it has made no attempt to communicate or flee. Identify its origin." The officer worked his controls and cross-referenced the vessel's design with their intelligence databases. And when the answer came, his scales paled even further. "It is human overlord." Krethvak's eyes narrowed at the unfamiliar word, and he searched his memory for information about this species. "Human?" he repeated slowly. "The primitive newcomers from the spiral arm. The ones who barely achieved space travel 2 centuries ago." "Yes, Overlord. They are one of the minor species affiliated with the Conclave, and they send one ship to face us?" The question hung in the air of the command deck, and none of the Varax officers could provide an answer that made sense. Krethvak studied the tiny vessel for a long moment, searching for some hidden threat or clever trap. But his sensors showed nothing except a single unremarkable ship crewed by a species that should have been too weak to matter. "Destroy it," he commanded finally. "Let it serve as the first blood of our conquest and a warning to the Conclave of what awaits them." 100 Varax destroyers broke from the main formation and accelerated toward the human vessel, their weapons charging with enough firepower to crack the crust of a small. Moon Captain Sarah Chen watched them coming on her tactical display, and she felt her heart beating steady and strong in her chest. "Enemy vessels approaching," her tactical officer reported. "They will be in weapons range in approximately 90 seconds. Maintain position," Sarah commanded. "Do not raise shields until I give the order." Her bridge crew exchanged glances, but obeyed without question, trusting their captain, even as death raced toward them across the void. The Varax destroyers reached optimal firing range and unleashed their weapons in a coordinated barrage that lit up the darkness with brilliant crimson light. Thousands of missiles and energy beams streaked toward the Remember, enough destructive power to reduce any normal vessel to scattered atoms. "Now," Sarah said quietly. The Remember shields activated in the instant before impact, and the energy barrier that surrounded the ship flared with white gold light that burned brighter than a star. The Varax weapons struck the barrier and detonated in a cascade of explosions that should have overwhelmed any defense system in the known galaxy. But when the light faded and the sensors cleared, the human ship remained exactly where it had been, completely untouched and completely undamaged aboard the Eternal Conquest. Overlord Krethvax stared at his display in disbelief as his tactical officer stammered through a damage report. "The human vessel is intact, Overlord. Our weapons had no effect on their shields." "Impossible," Krethvax growled. "Fire again. Concentrate all weapons on that single point." The destroyers obeyed, pouring everything they had into the barrier that protected the human ship. And still the Remember did not move and did not fount. Then it did move. In the space of 6 seconds, the human vessel crossed the distance to the Varax destroyers, accelerating at a rate that should have been impossible for any ship of that size. It did not fire weapons as it approached, and it did not attempt to maneuver around the enemy formation. Instead, it passed through them. The Remember tore through the Varax destroyers like a blade through paper, its shield somehow becoming a weapon that shredded armor and ruptured reactors with nothing more than contact. 100 destroyers became expanding clouds of debris and fire in less than 10 seconds. And the human ship emerged from the destruction without a single scratch on its dark, angular hull. Krethvax watched his ships die, and for the first time in his long career of conquest, he felt something cold settling into his chest. "All ships open fire," he commanded, his voice carrying an edge that his officers had never heard before. "Destroy that vessel now." The entire Varax fleet responded to his command, and 30,000 ships turned their weapons toward the single human craft that had just killed 100 of their number. Void filled with fire and light as enough weapons to sterilize. A dozen worlds converged on one small target, but the Remember was no longer where they were shooting. The ship moved through the Varax formation like a ghost, appearing and disappearing as it jumped from point to point with technology that none of the alien observers could explain everywhere it went death followed. And Varak ships died in groups of 10 and 20 and 50 as the human vessel carved a path of destruction that led directly toward the eternal. Conquest Rethvax watched his tactical display turn red with destroyed ships, and he finally understood the terrible truth that the galaxy had failed to see. The humans had not sent one ship because they were arrogant or foolish. They had sent one ship because one ship was all they needed. Aboard the flagship of the Conclave fleet, silence had fallen like a heavy blanket over every officer and commander who watched their tactical displays. High Arbiter Thyssen stood frozen before the main view screen, his reptilian eyes wide with an emotion that he had not felt in 300 years of rule fear. The holographic display showed the Varak's fleet in disarray, their precise formations shattered as ships tried desperately to escape or engage. The human vessel that moved among them like death itself. Admiral Vartan's stone face had cracked in ways that had nothing to do with physical damage, and his voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. How is this possible? Ambassador Lyra Chun stood at the back of the command deck where she had been permitted to observe as a representative of Earth, and she watched the battle unfold with an expression that mixed pride with deep sorrow. Ambassador? Thyssen turned to face her with something approaching respect in his ancient eyes. What is that ship? Lyra stepped forward until she stood among the alien commanders who had mocked her world just days before, and she clasped her hands behind her back as she began to speak. 217 years ago, an alien race discovered Earth, she said, her voice quiet but clear. They were called the Harvesters, though we never learned what they called themselves. The Kethra commander leaned forward with sudden interest, their compound eyes focusing on the human woman. We have heard rumors of this, they chittered, but the records are incomplete. They are incomplete because we do not speak of it often, Lyra replied. The memories are still too painful for many of us. She paused and looked at the view screen where the Remember continued its impossible battle against overwhelming odds. The Harvesters did not negotiate with us, and they did not warn us of their coming, and they did not offer us the chance to surrender. Her voice hardened with old anger that had been passed down through generations. They simply arrived one day and began taking what they wanted. And what they wanted was our water and our resources and our people. Your people? Vartan asked with confusion. They took humans as resources? They processed us, Lyra said flatly. Our bodies contained minerals and compounds that were useful to their technology, and they saw no more reason to negotiate with us than you would negotiate with livestock. The alien commanders shifted uncomfortably at her words, and even Thyssen's cold reptilian expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy. We had nothing when they came, Lyra continued. No space fleet, no advanced weapons, no allies among the stars, and no hope of rescue. She turned to face the assembled commanders directly. The war lasted 9 years, and in those 9 years we lost 4 billion people. The number hung in the air like a physical weight, and the alien officers who heard it struggled to comprehend the scale of death she described. 4 billion, Thyssen repeated slowly. Nearly half your species at that time. Yes, Lyra confirmed. Children and parents and lovers and friends, entire cities reduced to empty shells. Entire nations wiped from existence. Her eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. But we did not surrender, and we did not give up, and we did not stop fighting even when there seemed to be no hope left. On the view screen, the Remember reached a cluster of Varaks, battleships, and tore through them with weapons that blazed like captured stars. And the alien vessels crumbled before the human ship like sand castles before a wave. Our scientists worked until they collapsed at their stations, developing weapons and shields from the scraps of harvester technology that we captured, Lyra explained. Our soldiers fought in the streets and the mountains and the ruins of our cities. buying time with their lives so that others might survive. And you won? The Kethra commander asked with disbelief. Your primitive species defeated a force advanced enough for interstellar travel? We survived, Lyra corrected them, and yes. Eventually, we killed the last of the harvesters and destroyed their ships and ended the threat they posed to our world. She gestured toward the view screen, where the Remember had now reached the outer defense perimeter of the Varax command ship. The Remember carries the combined legacy of everything we learned in those terrible years, she said. Weapons that were designed by desperate geniuses who knew that failure meant extinction. Shields that were tested against enemies who showed no mercy. And engines that were built by engineers who understood that speed might be the only thing standing between humanity and death. Admiral Vertan stared at the human ambassador with new eyes, seeing her not as a representative of a primitive species, but as a survivor of horrors that his people had never faced. You built all of this from captured alien technology? He asked. We built it from everything we had, Lyra replied. From stolen technology and human ingenuity, and the absolute refusal to ever be helpless again. She turned back to the view screen as the Remember's weapons finally activated fully. A beam of concentrated light that lasted less than a heartbeat, but cut the Varax command ship cleanly in two. The crew of that ship are volunteers, she said quietly. 300 humans who trained their entire lives for a moment we prayed would never come. Who carry the names of the dead in their hearts and the determination of survivors in their souls. High Arbiter Thiessen watched the Varax flagship break apart and understood at last why the humans had responded to his demands with such calm confidence. You knew, he said slowly. You knew from the beginning that one ship would be enough. We hoped, Lyra corrected him gently. We always hope that we will never have to use what we built. But we also made certain that if the time came, we would be ready. She met Thessen's ancient eyes without fear. Humanity learned long ago that survival is not measured in numbers or in the size of your fleet. High Arbiter, then how is it measured? Thiessen asked. Lyra Chun smiled, and in that smile was the weight of 4 billion ghosts and the iron will of a species that had faced extinction and refused to fall. It is measured in will, she said. And human will is something that the galaxy has never seen before. On the view screen, the Remember turned toward the next cluster of Varax ships, and its dark hull gleamed with the reflected light of burning enemy vessels. The battle was not yet over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The battle lasted 4 hours, though those who watched it would later say that time itself seemed to bend around the events that unfolded in the darkness between stars. The Varax Dominion had entered that region of space with 32,000 warships and the absolute certainty of victory. That came from 2 centuries of unbroken conquest. They left with nothing. The Remember moved through their fleet like a force of nature that could not be stopped or reasoned with or escaped. And everywhere it went, the ships of the Dominion died in fire, and silence. Overlord Krethvax tried everything in his considerable experience to destroy the human vessel, concentrating the firepower of thousands of ships on a single target and surrounding it with formations designed to trap even the most agile enemy. Nothing worked. The human ship's shields absorbed punishment that would have cracked planets, and its weapons cut through Varax armor as if it were made of paper rather than the strongest alloys in the galaxy. When his flagship was destroyed, Krethvax transferred his command to another vessel, and when that vessel was destroyed, he transferred again, fleeing from ship to ship as the Remember hunted him across the battlefield. In the end, the great Overlord, who had conquered 11 species and burned 100 worlds, died alone on the bridge of a damaged cruiser. His last sight, the dark angular hull of the human ship as it delivered the final blow. The survivors of the Varax fleet scattered into the void, their formations broken and their will to fight shattered beyond repair. Some would eventually reach Dominion, space, and bring word of what had happened. And that word would spread fear through an empire that had never known defeat, but most simply fled into the darkness and were never seen again. Ghosts of a fleet that had expected to conquer the galaxy and instead met something that the galaxy had never encountered. Before the Remember returned to the Conclave fleet as the last, echoes of battle faded into silence, and its dark hull was scarred and blackened from 4 hours of continuous combat, but it was unbroken and its crew was alive. And its mission was complete. Captain Sarah Chun guided her ship to the position at the rear of the formation that Admiral Vortan had originally assigned. And nobody laughed this time. Nobody spoke at all. The alien commanders stared at their displays in stunned silence as the numbers scrolled past. 29,000 Vorax ships destroyed, and the rest scattered and fleeing. One human vessel had done what the combined might of 12 civilizations could not have accomplished in months of conventional warfare. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy began to change in ways both subtle and profound. The Conclave quietly updated its diplomatic classifications, removing humanity from the category of developing species and mired territorial power. Where they had been listed since first contact, a new category was created, one that had never existed in the 10,000 years of galactic civilization. And into this category only one species was placed: do not provoke. The Kethra stopped composing satirical songs about human foolishness and began studying human history with a desperate intensity that bordered on obsession. The Valadorians withdrew their war scholars from the lecture circuits and assigned them instead to analyze every scrap of information about Earth's military capabilities and across 100 worlds. The beings who had laughed at humanity's single ship now looked up at the stars with new understanding, and new fear. Ambassador Lyra Chen was invited to address the full conclave one final time. And when she entered the great chamber, she found it transformed from the place of mockery she had left behind. Every seat was filled, and every eye was fixed upon her. And the silence that greeted her arrival was not contempt, but something closer to reverence. High Arbiter Thiessen rose from his throne and spoke first, his ancient voice carrying a way of respect that he had not offered to any species in living memory. Ambassador Chen, the Conclave wishes to formally thank the human people for their contribution to the defense of the Orion Spur. Lyra nodded in acknowledgement, but did not smile. The Vorax threat has been eliminated, and the galaxy owes its safety to Earth and to the crew of the Remember. We did not do this for gratitude, Lyra replied, her voice echoing through the vast chamber. And we did not do this for the Conclave or for the galaxy. Thiessen tilted his head in confusion, and around the chamber alien faces reflected the same uncertainty. Then why? He asked. Because the Vorax threatened our colonies, Lyra said simply. Because they stood in the path of our people, and because we will not allow anyone to threaten what is ours ever again. She stepped forward until she stood at the center of the chamber, exactly where she had stood when she announced that humanity would send only one ship. You wondered why we sent one ship, she continued. And now you understand that we did not do so out of arrogance or ignorance or foolishness. Her eyes swept across the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. We sent one ship because that was what we needed. And we sent a message with it. Admiral Vertan's stone face was expressionless, but his voice carried genuine curiosity when he asked, "And what message was that?" Lyra Chun's expression was calm, but her eyes held the weight of 4 billion ghosts and the iron determination of a species that had survived the unthinkable. That humanity has already faced the end of the world, she said quietly. We have stood at the edge of extinction and looked into the abyss. And we clawed our way back through 9 years of hell and 4 billion dead. She paused and let her words sink into the silence of the chamber. We are not afraid of anything the galaxy can throw at us. because we have already survived the worst that the universe had to offer. Her voice hardened with warning that every being present understood clearly that the galaxy should be very careful about what it throws, because we remember everything that has ever been done to us, and we have made ourselves into something that can never be threatened again, High Arbiter. Thiessen stared at the human woman for a long moment, seeing in her small frame the spirit of a species that had faced annihilation and emerged stronger than before. "And if someone does threaten you?" he asked. Finally, Lara Chun smiled, and in that smile was the promise of consequences that no civilization would want to face. "Then we will send another ship," she said. "And we have many ships." She turned and walked from the chamber, leaving behind a galaxy that had learned at last why humans were not to be underestimated, and somewhere in the depths of space, the Remember continued its patrol, its crew watching over the human colonies that spread across the stars. They were the guardians of a species that refused to be victims, and they carried with them the memory of everything humanity had lost and everything humanity had become. The galaxy had questioned why humans sent one ship, and they had learned too late that the question itself was a mistake, because humanity did not measure strength in numbers. They measured it in will, and human will was infinite.